Well, good evening, folks, and welcome to our Tuesday night home Bible study. Tonight we'll be looking at Genesis 41, part of the Joseph novella. It actually is the lengthiest chapter in the story of Joseph. One of the things that's been a little bit different and will return to being a little bit different is that the chapters, the little segments in the story, tend to be a little shorter than they have been in the stories of Abraham and of Jacob, except for this particular segment. Again, the chapter divisions in the Bible were added in much later. Originally, the scriptures didn't have verse markings or chapter divisions or even punctuation in the original languages, and so all of that was added in, over time. But anyway, in chapter 41, Joseph is still in prison. He has encountered the chief butler and the chief baker of Pharaoh previously, and they each had a dream while they were there, and Joseph was able, with God's help, to give an interpretation to their dreams, which proved to be accurate. Only one of those men survived because the chief baker, Joseph, told him that his head would be lifted up off him in 3 days, and it sure was, and so he is no more. And the chief butler was restored back to being the cupbearer, really, for Pharaoh. And even though Joseph had urged him to think on him and treat me with chesed, with covenant love, that is, be faithful to the agreement that you'll remember me to Pharaoh and that I am, an innocent man in this prison, etc. The chief butler forgot him. And thus we begin chapter 41. And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed. And behold, he stood by the river. Now, when the Bible says the river, it's either the Euphrates or the Nile, depending upon where the story is set. And here it is certainly the Nile. He stood by the river, and behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored cows. Your King James will say kine, but that's an old word for cows. And fat-fleshed, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ill-favored and lean-fleshed, and stood by the other cows upon the brink of the river. And the ill-favored and lean-fleshed cows did eat up the 7 well-favored and fat cows. So Pharaoh awoke, and he slept and dreamed the second time. And behold, 7 ears of corn or grain came up upon one stalk, full and good. And behold, 7 thin ears and blasted or blighted with the east wind sprung up after them. And the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 fat and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Anytime you see the word behold in the Bible, by the way, it is exclamatory. And it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled. And he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men thereof. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that could interpret them unto Pharaoh. Then spoke the chief butler unto Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day. Pharaoh was wroth with his servants, and put me in prison in the captain of the guard's house, both me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream in one night, I and he. We dreamed each man according to the interpretation of his dream, or each dream with a particular meaning is the idea. And there was there with us a young man, a Hebrew, servant to the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted to us our dreams. Each man according to his dream he did interpret. And it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was. Me he restored unto mine office, and him he hanged. Notice Joseph's getting credit for the dreams coming true. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon, and he shaved himself and changed his raiment, and came in unto Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I have dreamed a dream, and there is none that can interpret it. And I have heard say of thee that thou canst understand a dream to interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace, or he will give you, an answer that will calm your soul, is the idea. Because Pharaoh stirred up. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, In my dream, behold, I stood upon the bank of the river. And behold, there came up out of the river 7 cows, fat-fleshed and well-favored, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ill-favored and lean-fleshed, such as I never saw in all the land of Egypt for badness. And the lean and ill-favored cows did eat up the first 7 fat cows. And when they had eaten them up, it could not be known that they had eaten them, but they were still ill-favored, as at the beginning. So I awoke. And I saw in my dream, and behold, 7 ears came up in one stalk, full and good. And behold, 7 ears withered thin and blasted with the east wind sprung up after them. And the thin ears devoured the 7 good ears. And I told this unto the magicians, and there was none that could declare it unto me. And Joseph said unto Pharaoh, The dream of Pharaoh is one. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years. The 7 good ears are 7 years. The dream is one. And the 7 thin and ill-favored cows that came up after them are 7 years. And the 7 empty ears, blasted with the east wind, shall be 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken unto Pharaoh. What God is about to do, he showeth unto Pharaoh. Behold, there come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, and there shall arise after them 7 years of famine. And all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. And the plenty shall not be known in the land by reason of the famine following, for it shall be very grievous. And for that the dream was doubled unto Pharaoh twice, it is because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass, or shortly put it into action. Now therefore let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years. Let them gather all the food of those good years that come, and lay up grain under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. And that food shall be for storage in the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh, and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, Can we find such an one as this is, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, Forasmuch as God has shown thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne shall I be greater than thou. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand, put it upon Joseph's hand, and he arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. Boy, that's better than a coat of many colors, isn't it? And he made him to ride in the 2nd chariot which he had, and they cried before him, Bow the knee. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphanath-Paaneah, Zaphanath-Paneah. I have to take a running start at that word. And he gave him as his wife Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah. Sounds a lot like Potiphar, but it's not. Priest of On. And Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. And in the 7 plenteous years the earth brought forth by handfuls. And he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities, the food of the field which was round about every city. He laid up in the same. And Joseph gathered grain as the sand of the sea very much, until he left or stopped numbering, for it was without number. And unto Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore unto him. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, which means forgetting, or really choosing to forget. For God, said he, has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second called he Ephraim, which means fruitful. For God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. And the 7 years of plenteousness that was in the land of Egypt were ended. And the 7 years of famine began to come, according as Joseph had said. And the dearth or the famine was in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, Go unto Joseph, what he saith to you, do. And the famine was over all the face of the earth. And Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold unto the Egyptians. And the famine waxed sore, or was severe, in all the land of Egypt. And all countries came into Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was so sore in all the lands. Well, 2 full years. I have an idea that 2 years in prison probably seemed like 20 years to Joseph. And Joseph had urged the chief butler to think on me and remember our agreement and show kindness according to our agreement, that you'll mention me to Pharaoh. And he forgot him. 2 whole years. You know, people sometimes will forget you, but God has a perfect memory. God has not forgotten him at all. And actually, it may have turned out to be a good thing in retrospect that the chief butler didn't remember Joseph right off. What if he had gone into Pharaoh and told Pharaoh about Joseph? There was this wonderful man that told, interpreted our dreams, and they came true, and he's innocent. And what if they had let Joseph go? Joseph would have probably gone back to the land of Canaan, gone home to his father, if he'd just been set free. But he's kept there in the prison, and he's there for 2 whole years until the time is exactly right. And when the time is right, he's still there in the prison where he can be found and where he can be located and brought before Pharaoh. God has a wonderful plan. Doesn't mean that everything that happens to us is going to be good, or is going to be fun, or we're going to enjoy it. But everything that he arranges is of importance. Again, Joseph is in preparation during this time too, as he was in the home of Potiphar, as he was the steward of the household, learning to manage all the affairs of the household. And Potiphar didn't worry about anything except the food that was on his plate, and he didn't worry about how he got there, because Joseph handled it. Joseph is learning more and a larger scale in the prison, taking care of the things there. The time is just right in God's timing when Pharaoh has a dream. Well, after 2 whole years, Pharaoh has a dream. In fact, he has two dreams. Remember how many dreams Joseph had? He had two dreams. He dreamed about the sheaves in the field and his brother's sheaves bowing down to his sheep. He dreamed about the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowing down to him. So when Pharaoh has two dreams that essentially are parallel to each other, Joseph is familiar with that. Isn't it interesting that Joseph's experiences with dreams enable him to help other people's experiences with dreams? God allows us to have experiences lots of times so that out of those experiences we can help other people when they have them. Anyway, Pharaoh has these dreams about the 7 fat cows and the 7 skinny cows that come up out of the Nile and devour the fat ones, but they're still just as skinny as they were before. The 7 ears on the stalk of grain that are fat and full, and 7 skinny ears that haven't filled out, and they're nothing but corn cobs, so to speak, on them. And the skinny ears devour the fat ears, but they're still skinny. Pharaoh wakes up in between these, and the 7 thin ears, we're told, verse 6, blasted with the east wind. To the Hebrew word for east wind was sirocco, and it referred to a dust storm kind of thing that would blow up, a desert storm that would blow up from the east into Canaan. The Egyptians had something similar to that they called a khamsin, and it actually blew from the south. Of course, the story is being told in the verbiage of the readers, and the hearers the first time would have been the Israelites there either preparing to go into the promised land or on the edge of the promised land, and it's told from the perspective of the ones reading it to start with. Again, it's really important when we tell a story, we tell it so that the readers can understand. And so the word for east wind is used, even though in Egypt it would have come from the south, most likely. Anyway, anytime you read about the east wind in the Bible, it has negative connotations because it refers to that sirocco, that desert storm that would blow in generally from the east. For example, before the waters of the Red Sea are parted, that sirocco blows all night upon the waters, and the next morning it divides and they go across. When Jonah is waiting for the fire from God and the brimstone to fall upon Nineveh after he's gone and preached and he's offered them no hope. He's just told them 40 days and God's going to destroy that city. And then they repented in sackcloth and ashes, and Jonah is there sitting, made him a little hut to sit in to watch the show when the fire falls, and got his popcorn ready, I guess, to for popping by the flames, and it doesn't do that, and Jonah is all upset, and then the sun is beating down on him, and the sirocco blows in on him, and and he begs for the Lord to just take him on. Anyway, every time you see that in the Old Testament, it's sort of a negative kind of picture, because those storms were not pleasant things, and it has negative connotations. And so the 7 thin ears blasted with this sirocco, and he has these 2 dreams. He wakes up in between them. He has the first dream, he wakes up, goes back to sleep, has the second dream, and the next morning we're told his spirit was troubled. I don't know about you, there's been a time or two that I can recall when I would have had a dream in the night. Sometimes I don't even remember exactly what it was, but there are times when you have a dream that's not pleasant and you wake up and you're just sort of you just sort of don't feel good, and you're just sort of not real happy when you wake up. It's because of that dream. And here is Pharaoh, and he is troubled, or he's stirred up is the idea. And so he calls for all of his magicians and his wise men. By the way, these same two groups, the magicians and the wise men, are the ones later on, a different generation of them, but they're the ones later on that they can throw their rods down and they turn into serpents, just like Moses can do with his, except Moses' rod that turns into a serpent eats up their serpents. They're the same group that later on, different generation, that they can make the water turn into blood, but they can't turn it back. They can make the frogs come out of the river when all the frogs are already coming out of the river, but they can't put them back. And again, the forces of evil do have some power, but they don't have all power. And so these the two terms, the one for magician here is kartumim, this plural of kartam, but it refers to the root meaning is that of a stylus that is used to engrave clay tablets, and so it can also be rendered scribe, and it refers to one who engraves, and also is used for horoscopists, I have read. So anyway, they're involved in the occult. And then all the wise men, and the word for wise men there really refers to skillful ones. And so these are all the educated and the ones that practice in the black arts, but they are in the dark as far as the dream of Pharaoh goes. None could interpret the dream. Then the light goes on in the chief butler's mind, and he remembers for the first time Joseph in the prison. And he says, I remember my fault this day, and I remember when me and the chief baker, rest his soul, were put into the prison, and we each had a dream the same night, and there was this young man, a Hebrew, who gave us the interpretation. And he gives Joseph all the credit, even though back in chapter 40, Joseph had said that the interpretation, don't interpretations belong to God, verse 8 of chapter 40. And so Joseph had not claimed the ability to interpret, but God had enabled him to understand. The chief butler doesn't worry about who Joseph's God was. He just relates it to Joseph. And in fact, he says, verse 13, as he interpreted to us, so it was. He, Joseph, restored to me and to mine office. And the other one, he, Joseph, hanged. He gives Joseph the credit for what took place in response to the dream. And so he paints Joseph in very large figures here. So Pharaoh sends for Joseph, they bring him quickly out of the dungeon. He shaves himself, and again, this is the first time in Scripture you read about anybody shaving, and very seldom do you read about this. In the book of Exodus, the Levites were all, as part of their ceremonial being set aside for ministry work with the tabernacle, they were all to be shaven all over their bodies. The Egyptians were real big on this, and the Egyptian priests, I read, shaved themselves, like every other day, all over. And anyway, Joseph, gets cleaned up, shaves himself, comes and changes clothes, comes into Pharaoh. And Pharaoh tells him the dream, and I understand that you can interpret it. And Joseph again says, it's not in me. God will give you an answer of peace. And the idea is God will give you an answer that'll put you to rest. You're all stirred up from having these dreams. God will help you understand, and then you'll be at rest. he doesn't really say you're going to have it's going to all turn out in a pleasant way is not the idea here. But Joseph hasn't heard the dreams yet. So Pharaoh tells him the dreams, that the 7 fat cows and skinny cows, 7 fat ears, skinny ears. And Joseph hears the dreams, and lo and behold, Pharaoh has had 2 dreams that are parallel to each other, just like the 2 dreams that Joseph had back when he was 17. Some time has gone by now. We're told just a few verses on down that Joseph was 30 now. So a lot of time has gone by. Part of it he was a slave. Part of it he's been a convict, but he still remembers back to when he was 17, 13 years ago. And so he tells Pharaoh, he says, the dream is one. Both dreams mean the same thing. The 7 fat cows are the same thing as the 7 fat ears. 7 skinny cows, same thing as the 7 skinny ears. And each group of those means 7 years. So there's going to be 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. And he says that because this has been doubled, it is established by God. It is certain. It's not just maybe going to happen. It is certain that it's going to happen. And God will shortly bring it to pass, or he will shortly begin this process, verse 32. Then Joseph, he has one chance to stand before Pharaoh. And Joseph has been praying, I'm sure, for this opportunity. He's been waiting 2 whole years since the chief butler was restored back to his job. This is his one and only opportunity. And Joseph is determined to make it count. He's not going to let this opportunity go by. He has one chance that he's up to bat, and he's going to hit a home run if he can, or go down swinging. So he says, now Pharaoh needs to find somebody that's discreet and wise to put over the land of Egypt during the 7 years of plenty, to store up food, store up grain, store up what is needed for provisions for during the 7 years of famine. Because the famine is going to be so bad that it'll be as though the 7 years of plenty had not even existed. And so they need to store it up. Verse 35. By the way, archaeologists have discovered that there were large silos in different cities in the land of Egypt in ancient times that were used for storing grain. So anyway, this food will be for storage and for to live on during the famine. Pharaoh needs somebody to oversee this that is wise and has great discretion. And Pharaoh looked around at his servants and said, can we find somebody like this? And then he says, can we find a man in whom the Spirit of God is? This is the first time in Scripture that the Spirit of God is linked to a person having understanding and being guided by God personally, which is a pretty good step. Joseph is the first time that we're told about the Spirit of God doing this. Prior to this, we're told the Spirit of God was moving upon the face of the deep back in chapter 1, and a couple other times mentioned, but this is the first time that it's related to the God giving guidance to a human being. And Pharaoh looks around at his servants, and I guess they're giving him kind of a blank look right back, just like they gave him when he asked, what do the dreams mean? And so he turns to Joseph and said, well, who better than the one that understood the dream? We're going to let you be over all of this. And he says, I'm putting you over the land of Egypt. And You'll be over my house. According to your word will all my people be ruled, and only in the throne will I be greater than you. Remember Joseph's words to Potiphar's wife? There's none greater in this house but me. And the only thing he's held back from me is you, because you're his wife. Joseph was faithful in that small thing of being over Potiphar's house. And now God's giving him a chance at a much larger ministry. Remember the parable of the talents that Jesus told, and when the faithful servants were called into account for the money that they had used of their master, the one with the 10 talents, the master says, well done, good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. Now I'll make thee ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of thy Lord. Faithfulness is rewarded by being given a greater chance to serve. Joseph has proven himself faithful in the smaller settings of the household of Potiphar and in the prison. And now God is rewarding him with a larger way to serve. Pharaoh takes off his ring that would have had his signet on it, that would have, to seal in the wax that's our signature comes from that. It would be Pharaoh's symbol, that he had all the authority of Pharaoh with that ring. And he puts it on Joseph's hand, arrays him in vestures of fine linen and a chain of gold around his neck. That's even better. I think I said it when I was reading it. Couldn't help it. Better than a coat of many colors. And makes him ride in the second chariot. He gets to, go around in Air Force Two, and had somebody run before him to tell the people to bow down. Joseph is coming, bow the knee. And then Pharaoh makes a decree, verse 44. And he says to Joseph, I am Pharaoh. You notice the am is italicized. It's Ani Pharaoh. The reason I point this out, when we get to the book of Exodus, there is a formula all through the book of Exodus where Ani Pharaoh is replaced with Ani Yahweh. I am the Lord. And it's used as the basis for almost everything that the Lord commands. Yeah, you find it, if you want to look these up later, Exodus 6, verse 2, and verse 6, and verse 7, Exodus 20 and verse 2, it's used as the basis that I'm giving you to these 10 commandments. Why? Because Ani Yahweh, I am the Lord. The fact that he is the Lord, that he is the one who is reason enough for him to be able to give any command he wants to. And so Pharaoh uses this, and this is court language. Ani Pharaoh, without you, no one will lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. His word was law, and there's a new law made. Joseph is in charge of everything. And so he gives Joseph a new name, Zaphanath Paneah. It's probably easier to just say what it means. God speaks, he hears. That's what that word means. Joseph's new name is God speaks and he hears. And so he gives him a wife, daughter of one of the priests of the Egyptian god On. And then Joseph, he's about 30 years old, and during the 7 years of plenty, he has 2 sons. Also, we're told that Joseph goes out from the presence of Pharaoh and goes throughout all the land of Egypt. He's free at last. Yes, he goes through all the land of Egypt to do his work, but he goes through all the land of Egypt at his own desire, because he is now set free. He's not just free, he's free and in charge of everything. What a turnaround from being the lowest of the low to being the second most powerful man in that part of the world. I'll tell you, the Lord can turn the tables quite drastically when he gets going. Well, 7 years of plenty went right by. 2 sons born to Joseph. I named the first one Manasseh, which means forgetting. It's not the only Hebrew word for forgetting. In fact, back in verse 23 of the last verse of the previous chapter, when it says the chief butler forgot Joseph, that's a whole different word. Again, there's different kinds of forgetting. There's, I forgot to put gas in the car, I forgot to, pay the power bill. I forgot this or I forgot that. Those are things that slip our mind. That's one kind of forgetting. The kind of forgetting that's talked about in verse 51 with the name Manasseh is the kind of forgetting that you choose to not remember. The thing is, Joseph had been struggling to try to not remember all the bad that's been done to him. And I'm sure he had plenty of time in the prison that it kept coming to mind, kept coming to mind, kept coming to mind. But now that God has elevated him and set him free, given him a greater work to do, and Joseph's finding fulfillment in living out the plan that God has for him, and Joseph is seeing the dreams begin to come true that he dreamed back at 17 years of age, God is enabling him to not think about, to not remember all that bad that was done to him. The only way we can actually forget the wrong that's been done to us is for God to help us do that. Doesn't mean that he erases it from memory, but he can enable us to not dwell on it, to not think about it, to not be shaped by it. And that's the kind of forgetting that he's talking about here with that firstborn. God has made me forget all my toil, slavery, bondage, and all of this, and all my father's house, all that happened there. The name of the second son, Ephraim. Fruitfulness, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Started off so bad. Started off as a slave and then ended up in prison and was there, and it was just bad. But it's turned out so good. Lots of times, things that start off bad can end up good. In fact, that's the story of salvation. God takes bad people like me, like you, who've got a bad sin problem, and he turns it around, turns us around, and transforms us by the power of the blood that was shed on the cross by the Son of God, Jesus Christ, who died and paid for all our sins and rose again, living proof that we can be forgiven, we can be put right with God, and we can be transformed and made into new creatures if we'll trust in him as our Lord and our Savior. Thanks for joining in with us tonight, and we'll see you next week.